On a 2024 shift at the Vienna Area Control Center, ACC, the hardest part is maintaining standard separation and workable throughput across linked sectors, while the hub cycles roughly 60 to 80 movements per hour. Surveillance feeds such as Mode Select, Mode S, and Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast, ADSB, refresh every 2 to 5 seconds, and decisions follow published procedures rather than personal preference. This narrative maps how that pressure forms in Europe between 2001 and 2024, using a major hub and its area control unit as the baseline. It follows the day from physiology to tools, from separation minima to flow management, from abnormal events to weather and staffing, and then to automation. The practical value is a clear model for why workload spikes when rules, traffic, and tools intersect, expressed in minutes, miles, and flight levels rather than vague impressions. Anchors include reduced vertical separation minima, RVSM, at flight levels 290 through 410 in January 24, 2002, the ash closures after Eyjafjallajökull in April 2010, and the collapse of passenger demand by 80 to 90% in March 2020. The frame stays European. The European Organization for the Safety of Air Navigation, Eurocontrol, launched the Central Flow Management Unit, CFMU, in 1996, and since 2011, the Network Manager, NM, has set the daily plan and monitored execution, while European Union, EU, Regulation number 716/2014 from 2014 steers Single European Sky Air Traffic Management Research, CSAR, deployment across airports and ACCs. A hub's tower, approach, and en route sectors share constraints on slot programs, night noise windows after 10 p.m., and wake turbulence spacing on 2 or more runways. Instead of one display and one rulebook, most positions coordinate several human-machine interfaces, HMI, multiple frequency plans, and letters of agreement that cross national boundaries. The path we follow begins at 4:30 a.m. on a Vienna night shift in 2024, when physiology and attention define the first limits before tools can help. At 4:30 a.m. in Vienna in 2024, the night shift sits at a dimmed console and checks sector status, runway configuration, and staffing list before the first handover in 2 to 4 minutes. The body's temperature and alertness sit at a circadian low around 4 to 5 a.m., so the starting assumption is reduced vigilance compared with an afternoon spell between 2 and 6 p.m. The position opens with traffic counts in single digits per quarter hour rather than the 20 or 30 seen after 7 a.m., yet the same separation standards apply in nautical miles and flight levels. The contrast is simple: fewer movements, slower metabolism, equal responsibility. That frame sets the cost of attention lapses in seconds rather than hours. Across Europe after 2001, most providers cap continuous time on a radar position at roughly 120 minutes, with total duty capped near 8 to 10 hours on a standard day or night. In Vienna and comparable hubs, the roster often cycles morning, afternoon, and night across a 7 to 9 day block, with recovery days after the last night. Limits on overtime and minimum rest windows of at least 10 to 12 hours sit in local manuals rather than only in broad European guidance. Instead of extending a tired controller on position, supervisors reconfigure sectors to match demand in 30 to 60 minute steps. The practical unit of stamina is the 2-hour position cycle that begins on the clock at 5 a.m. or any other start time set by the traffic plan. A typical pattern is 90 minutes on and 30 minutes off, though some units prefer 75 minutes on and 45 minutes off to protect attention near dawn. Each on period begins with a structured readback of runway use, special use airspace and equipment status, and ends with a handover checklist that names every inbound stream and crossing level. This discipline reduces surprises. However, it increases the number of transitions, and every transition carries a 2 to 4 minute window where both controllers must keep the whole picture in working memory. Microbreaks are the second tool and last only 5 to 10 minutes, usually inserted mid-cycle rather than at the end. Hydration targets are modest, about 200 to 300 milliliters of water every 30 to 60 minutes, because dehydration of even 2% impairs attention by measurable margins. Caffeine is managed rather than banned. Many units point to the European Food Safety Authority limit of 400 milligrams per day for adults, and local guidance suggests a last coffee no later than 1 or 2 a.m. on a night shift to avoid rebound fatigue by 5 a.m. Instead of large energy drinks, most prefer small doses, such as 1 espresso at 90-minute intervals. Error likelihood changes with the clock, so managers plan around it as much as they plan around traffic peaks at 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. Several European audits in the 2010 to 2019 window found more redback corrections and late conflict detections per 100,000 clearances on night duty than on day duty, with differences on the order of tens of percent rather than single digits. That signal is strongest between 3 and 5 a.m., which overlaps the Vienna handover at 4:30 a.m. The mitigation is procedural redundancy, strip annotations, cross-checks during transfers, and conservative climb rates to protect vertical separation while attention is most taxed. Fatigue monitoring now mixes subjective and objective tools, and both appear in training and recurrent checks 2 to 4 times a year. Many units use the Karolinska sleepiness scale from 1 to 9 before and after a shift to profile personal risk, then pair that with a 5-minute psychomotor vigilance test that counts reaction lapses longer than 500 milliseconds. Some centers add wrist activity monitoring for a week during roster changes to see whether controllers actually obtain 7 to 9 hours of sleep between 2 consecutive nights. The point is not enforcement but prediction. If a roster pattern produces more lapses per 100 tests, supervisors adjust start times by 30 minutes or rebalance the on-off ratio. Mental workload is measured indirectly through communications density and conflict probes, and both track in minutes rather than hours. In the first half hour after 5 a.m., a Vienna approach position may issue only a handful of vectoring instructions and speed controls per 10-minute window, while the same position near 8 a.m. may issue dozens. Speech rate in plain aviation English typically sits near 150 to 180 words per minute on very high frequency channels, and any increase beyond that tends to raise readback errors. Instead of pushing pace, the night team slows delivery slightly and uses standard phraseology to keep working memory load stable across the cycle. Nutrition and light levels are simple levers, yet they move metrics that matter on a night duty measured to the minute. A small meal with low, simple sugars during the first off period around 6 a.m. avoids a postprandial dip during the second on period that runs to 7:30 a.m. Blue reduced lighting at consoles reduces glare after midnight. However, most centers raise ambient levels slightly after 5 a.m. to prepare for the day wave of departures and arrivals. That change occurs on a clock, not a hunch, usually in 5 or 10-minute steps. The aim is consistent arousal without overstimulation that could push speech pace or cursor movements faster than the plan expects. By the final handover before 7 a.m., the night team has traded raw stamina for structure, fixed on-off cycles in minutes, controlled caffeine in milligrams, checklist with name streams, and lighting in measured lux. The micro-conclusion is clear in Vienna in 2024 and in other European hubs since 2001. Attention holds when the environment is engineered in small units of time and load. The next boundary is set by the workstation itself, where the human-machine interface, the electronic flight progress tools, and the communication stack either support that focus or slice it into fragments. On the approach position in Vienna between 2011 and 2024, the core picture comes from mode select radar plots and automatic dependent surveillance broadcast tracks that update every 2 to 5 seconds. the controller watches 2 or 3 coordinated displays that merge multilateration, primary returns, and track labels with call signs, assigned altitudes, and ground speeds in knots. The room standardizes brightness in measured lux and font sizes in pixels, so eyes adapt in minutes rather than hours. Each track label includes level information in hundreds of feet, and a climb or descent arrow that updates faster with mode select than with conventional secondary surveillance. Instead of one screen per task, most positions carry a plan display and a tactical display, plus a separate pane for electronic coordination. This tight bundle of tools sets the pace for vectors to a final approach that may run near 3 nautical miles in trail during the light winds. The human-machine interface appears in practical steps rather than slogans, because every click costs seconds. Window arrangements are fixed by local orders with layouts that place conflict probes within 1 or 2 mouse moves of the radar picture. Input devices use firm detents and moderate travel, so the cursor lands where intended during a tense 10-second vectoring window. Colors are standardized to avoid confusion between cleared altitude and selected altitude across adjacent sectors that may swap feeds several times per hour. In training, the instructor measures how many seconds pass between an alert tone and the first corrective instruction, because that reaction time links directly to miles gained or lost. A common target is to keep the first response under 10 seconds during medium complexity. Electronic flight progress strips replace paper cards and move through statuses in predictable sequences that mirror departures, transitions, and approaches. A Vienna flight may appear as a pre-departure entry 5 to 15 minutes before off-block, then advance to an active strip after the off-block time hits the network plan. Supervisors can filter strips by runway, standard instrument departure, or weight category in 1 or 2 clicks, which compresses scanning time by a measurable percentage compared with paper. Coordination messages between tower, approach, and en route units travel in seconds rather than minutes, which tightens the loop for pushback approval when stands are scarce. Instead of a handwritten remarks, controllers add structured tags that the conflict probe can parse when calculating separation in the next sector. Voice remains the primary tool, and its limits define sector capacity more than most new software. Very high frequency after one initial expansion as very high frequency occupies the band from 118 to 136 MHz for civil use, and ultra-high frequency serves some state and military flights above 225 MHz. A single approach frequency supports roughly 20 to 40 transmissions per minute before overlap and blocked calls reduce clarity. Guard on 121.5 MHz listens for Mayday traffic while the main frequency handles vectors, speed control, and altitude changes. Split frequencies and sectorization relieve load, but every split adds a handover and 2 readbacks that consume tens of seconds. The practical balance places one frequency near saturation, while a second frequency absorbs peaks during defined arrival waves. Controller Pilot Data Link Communications, after one initial expansion as Controller Pilot Data Link Communications, reduces readback errors and supports structured route changes in cruise, yet its cycle time runs in tens of seconds rather than single digits. A routine climb request over data link may take 30 to 90 seconds from uplink to pilot acceptance and execution, which is slower than a 5-second voice exchange on very high frequency. In terminal areas with short legs and tight turns, these extra seconds matter, so most units reserve data link for en route sectors and predictable clearances. Lost connectivity or late logons also occur, so procedural backups keep voice as the default for step climbs, vectors, and speed control near the hub. Instead of replacing speech, data link trims specific error types and helps during stable flows rather than in tight merges. Power and network resilience show up as N+1 redundancy rather than marketing claims, because radios and servers fail in the real world. Each critical rack sits behind uninterruptible power supplies sized for minutes, and diesel generators cover hours with automatic starts measured in seconds. Switches and servers run on dual feeds and dual network paths, so a single card failure does not darken the surveillance picture. The test is simple. During drills twice per year, technicians drop one supply and time the switchover while the controller maintains vectors. A clean switchover keeps the radar and strips alive with only a brief banner. A messy one adds seconds of delay that degrade the morning arrival rate by measurable percentages. Raw channel capacity determines how many instructions fit in a minute, and that ratio differs between voice and text. A busy, very high-frequency channel near the hub may carry 30 or more short exchanges in 60 seconds, while data link handles only a handful of clearances because every transaction has setup and confirmation phases. Voice allows tactical compression through clipped standard phraseology that keeps meaning within 4 to 7 seconds, but it also risks overlap and blocked calls during peak complexity. Text reduces ambiguity and preserves audit trails in bytes, yet it slows decision cycles when vectors must fit within a 4-mile downwind leg. The operational choice favors voice for time-critical control and text for structured cruise clearances, rather than assuming a single tool wins across all phases. At the console, the last supports are small but consistent. A headset with dual earpieces for improved signal-to-noise by a few decibels, a foot switch as a backup to a push-to-talk key, and pre-selected standby frequencies to cut setup time by seconds. Quick access menus store common clearances such as descend to 5,000 feet or reduce to 180 knots, which shortens keystroke sequences under pressure. During the night window between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., lights dim and noise drops below firm targets in decibels to preserve focus. However, radios stay at calibrated gains, so weaker general aviation transmitters remain readable. These specifics protect every second at the edge of capacity. With these tools in place from 2011 through 2024, the workplace supports fast, precise action when traffic pulses in banks every 30 to 60 minutes. The micro-conclusion is simple. The interface either returns seconds to the controller or steals them through awkward layouts and slow transactions. The next layer is procedural because the separation standards, wake turbulence groups, and published routes set the hard limits on what the best console can achieve. A major hub relies on standard instrument departure routes and standard terminal arrival routes, after one initial expansion as standard instrument departure and standard terminal arrival route, which knit traffic into predictable streams around the city. After the European reduced vertical separation minima took effect on January 24, 2002, the core vertical minimum between flight levels 290 and 410 fell from 2,000 feet to 1,000 feet. That change doubled the available flight levels in cruise and allowed denser step climbs and descents into the terminal area. The hub also maintains parallel runway procedures that set 5 or 6 nautical mile spacing on final when wind, runway surface, and braking action match published limits. Instead of ad hoc choices, the plan follows charts and minima that were validated in simulations and in staged trials. Vertical and horizontal minima appear as firm numbers tied to sensors and look-ahead times, not as suggestions. In most European terminal areas, surveillance separation may reduce to 3 nautical miles when both aircraft carry transponders with mode select features that update quickly and when the display meets a specific accuracy class. En route sectors usually run 5 nautical miles laterally, with vertical separation in 1,000 footsteps across the reduced vertical separation minima band. Controllers also apply wake turbulence categories that add spacing behind heavy types, measured in minutes or miles depending on the procedure. When wind shifts or braking action changes, the allowed spacing increases and the arrival rate falls by measurable percentages, which cascades back into holding and slot programs. Conflict detection tools formalize attention into timers, arrows, and predictive rings that extend 1 to 2 minutes ahead in terminal airspace. Short-term conflict alert, after one initial expansion as short-term conflict alert, throws a visual and audible alarm when projected minima fall below set thresholds in seconds. Medium-term probes look 10 to 20 minutes ahead and help sequence climbs and descents across crossing routes. The controller still owns the decision, yet the tool cuts search time by focusing attention on the highest risk pairs. In practice, the benefit appears as earlier speed control, more stable headings, and fewer late turn instructions on base and final. Speed policies link directly to safety and noise, and the most visible one is the 250 knot limit below 10,000 feet under instrument rules. A Vienna arrival that crosses the terminal boundary may carry 230 knots until a published fix, then slow stepwise to 180 knots on downwind and 160 knots to 4 nautical miles on final. These numbers vary by runway and equipment, yet they save miles in the sequence because predictable speed tails simplify merges. Night noise windows after 10 p.m. also add constraints by runway and type, which may force longer finals or different runway assignments. The sum is a timetable measured in knots and minutes rather than slogans about efficiency. Loss of communications procedures sit ready because radios or audio panels fail in the real world. A pilot who cannot transmit or receive squawks 7600 and follows the published lost comms route, maintaining the last assigned altitude for a defined period before climbing or descending to the filed level. In the Vienna context, approach gives priority vectors to clear the path, and coordination with adjacent sectors confirms the plan in minutes rather than tens of minutes. If the aircraft reappears on voice, the controller requires a clear readback before resuming normal vectors. The aim is predictability more than speed, since surprises cost separation in miles. Interception procedures stay rare in the hub environment, but the rules still matter because non-responses occur. A squawk of 7500 indicates unlawful interference, and 7700 indicates a general emergency, which triggers standard actions across civil and military units. National air policing units can launch within minutes, and military aircraft use visual signals that follow international rules for turns, gear, and lights to steer the target. Coordination across borders takes place through predefined lines that were tested during regional exercises in the 2010 to 2020 period. These scenarios remain exceptional. However, training keeps response times in minutes because the cost of delay is high. After these procedures and minima are applied in sequence, the system produces a stable arrival and departure pattern that fits within known capacities by runway and sector. The micro-conclusion is that clear minima and published tracks help controllers convert seconds of attention into miles of safety without guesswork. The next layer is managing the volume that arrives at those minima, because flow control at the network level can overwhelm or underfill a sector by dozens of movements per hour. Network flow management in Europe began with the Central Flow Management Unit in 1996 and expanded in 2011 when Eurocontrol took the role of network manager. That history matters because the Vienna hub does not live alone. It sits inside a mesh of sectors, airports, and weather systems that change by the hour. Air traffic flow management, after one initial expansion as air traffic flow management, uses declared capacities per sector and per airport to calculate how many flights can pass per hour without saturating frequencies or increasing conflicts beyond safe targets. The system issues slot programs that assign takeoff times to balance demand in 5 or 15-minute blocks. Instead of handling surges ad hoc, the day starts with a plan that measures delay in minutes and distributes it across departures. Calculated takeoff time after one initial expansion as calculated takeoff time anchors the local timeline to the network plan with a tolerance window defined in minutes. A flight with a slot might receive a window of -5 to +10 minutes around the assigned time, and missing that window risks a new slot that adds tens of minutes of delay. Ground handlers, pilots, and controllers coordinate to meet that time by adjusting pushback, engine start, and taxi pace, while approach and en route units sequence arrivals to preserve spacing. If a storm cell or runway inspection cuts capacity by a third during a half-hour period, the network manager recalculates regulations and spreads delays rather than pushing one bottleneck to failure. The math is visible on a monitor that lists regulations by cause and sector. Sector regulations translate to numbers a controller can feel on frequency. If a sector's declared capacity is 30 entries per hour and demand rises to 40, the calculated delay may reach tens of minutes spread across the period. Each additional minute shifts workload across the day and can force split sectors to open at 8 a.m. rather than 9 a.m., which requires extra staff. Conversely, when traffic drops below declared capacity for an hour, the plan may relax regulations and allow extra movements to reduce overall delay. The goal is to keep frequencies below saturation and conflict alerts within manageable counts per 10 minutes. Measured this way, success is a low average delay per flight across the network rather than zero delay at a single field. Route choice also changed between 2001 and 2024, and that shift shows up in track miles and sector loads. Earlier, most flights used published airways that stepped from fixed point to fixed point across national boundaries, which concentrated traffic in corridors. As free route airspace expanded to a network level in 2024, many flights filed direct segments across upper sectors, saving dozens of nautical miles on some city pairs. This reduced fuel burn and en route time by measurable percentages. However, it also redistributed workload, sometimes moving complexity from one sector to another. Controllers adjusted by refining sector boundaries and by using flexible use of airspace arrangements that open military areas on a schedule measured in minutes. The comparison is clear. Shorter tracks overall, more dynamic hotspots. At the airport, arrival management and departure management tools translate network plans into local sequences in minutes. Time-based spacing on final approach holds intervals stable during gusty crosswinds when distance-based spacing would fluctuate, which protects the runway throughput by single-digit percentages. Departure metering smooths pushbacks into the taxiway system so very high-frequency calls do not stack beyond comfortable rates. When a corner of the system clogs, ground and tower coordinate small holds at the gate or at the runway entry to keep off-block to airborne times within the slot window. Instead of queuing 10 aircraft on a single taxiway, the plan spreads them across time by increments of 1 or 2 minutes. Compliance with the calculated takeoff time window becomes a daily discipline with tangible benefits. Meeting the window helps the network keep average delay per flight in the single digits across a day, whereas missing it by tens of minutes pushes other flights into new delays. Airlines track this as minutes per rotation, and controllers track it as frequency occupancy and stable spacing on final. The connection loops back to the console. Clear human-machine interfaces and efficient strip tools return seconds to the operator, and those seconds add up to window compliance by the end of an hour. Flow management is, in practice, the art of turning individual seconds into collective minutes. With network rules, slot times, and free route options defined, the system can still face sudden shocks that ignore plans written at 6 a.m. The micro-conclusion for Vienna and its neighbors is that air traffic flow management dampens peaks and fills troughs, yet it does not erase emergencies, equipment failures, or weather that changes within 10 minutes. The next chapter turns to those abnormal scenarios where codes, checklists, and inter-unit coordination decide whether a sector absorbs the shock or passes it forward. In Vienna in 2018, an approach controller watched a transponder flip to 7700, 7600, or 7500 and moved through a fixed set of steps that lived in checklists rather than memory tricks. The numbers mattered because each code drove a different cadence on the very high frequency channel and a different line to supervisors. A general emergency on 7700 moved traffic off a runway in minutes and prime services on the ground. Loss of communications on 7600 triggered standardized vectoring patterns and clock rules that preserved separation when voice failed. Unlawful interference on 7500 pulled in police and military chains that had been tested in exercises on specific weekdays, often before 9 a.m. The key point was that one hex set of digits transformed frequency use and runway rights within seconds. Radio failure stayed the most common abnormal scenario, and consumed capacity measured in single-digit percentages during peaks. A crew that could not transmit or receive followed the lost communications route in the published chart and held the last assigned altitude for a set time before climbing or descending to the cleared level. In Vienna, controllers protected that path by moving other streams early and by using speed control to widen time gaps on final by 1 or 2 minutes. Coordination with adjacent sectors traveled on landlines to confirm the expected exit fix and level, so nobody cleared an opposite move. Instead of improvising, the approach team talked less on the main frequency and more on intercoms, which preserved room on air for emergency calls. Emergency landings compressed time across the room, yet every minute had a fixed owner. A crew that declared Mayday with a fuel problem or smoke on board got a direct vector to final and, if needed, a long straight-in that used 5 or more minutes of runway occupancy to avoid a rushed exit. Rescue and firefighting service, after one initial expansion as rescue and firefighting service, rolled within 90 to 120 seconds once the call reached the dispatch desk and the tower confirmed category and staging points by the book. The runway check after a high-energy stop took more minutes and forced a recalculation of arrival gaps that gathered upstream in stacks. The better the pre-brief at the top of the hour, the faster the room could swap from dual runway modes to single runway operations without losing the picture. Bird strike remained an external trigger with variable outcomes, and its handling depended on phase of flight and type. A strike on takeoff near 1,000 feet often produced a return and an overweight landing request that consumed 10 to 20 minutes, while a strike on approach could prompt a go-around that the tower absorbed if spacing on final held at 4 miles or more. Wildlife control teams patrolled movement areas on cycles measured in tens of minutes at dawn and dusk, and data on hotspots near water or fields fed seasonal plans. The controller's task reduced to a clean sequence: protect the return path, keep a spare block on final, and raise the runway inspection as soon as the aircraft exited. Compared with engine failure or smoke, this case burned more taxi minutes and fewer airborne miles. Runway priority rules were simple in print and delicate on frequency. An emergency used the runway it needed, and everything else shifted to holds, vectors, or different runway entries. Intersection departures paused even when gaps appeared, because the surface plan favored predictable flows and full-length departures for better wake turbulence spacing. A Vienna sidestep or parallel runway switch saved minutes only when wind and braking action met, set thresholds published in the local manual. The tower called spacing in miles and seconds, approach called headings and speeds, ground called routes in letters. Each small choice rebuilt a stable queue after the event rather than chasing momentary holes. The contrast between daytime and nighttime procedures showed up most in the support chain rather than in separation rules. At 2 p.m., every unit from maintenance to de-icing stood ready with full staffing, so a runway sweep or a tug tow happened in single-digit minutes. At 2 a.m., the same action took longer because teams were smaller or on-call, so the plan biased toward keeping one runway open and avoiding complex taxi patterns in low staffing windows. On voice, redbacks were slower at night because pilots and controllers shared the same circadian valley between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. The difference did not change minima in miles or feet, but it stretched timelines in minutes and raised the value of clear phraseology. Abnormal drills kept the room aligned with these timelines, and they ran 2 to 4 times per year on simulators that reproduced Vienna procedures to the letter. Scenarios included compound failures, such as a lost communications aircraft entering from the north, while an emergency return approached from the west, with the same wind and runway status as a known day in the previous year. Instructors timed the first call, the first vector, the first coordination with the rescue and firefighting service, and the first landing gap opened on final. Results were tracked as seconds saved compared with the previous run. Rather than testing heroics, the exercise tested repeatable steps under clock pressure. The micro-conclusion for Vienna and comparable European hubs is that abnormal operations live in numbers tied to codes, seconds, and miles, and those numbers can be trained and measured. The bridge to the next risk is weather and external constraints, where visibility in meters, wind in knots, ash concentration in micrograms per cubic meter, and airspace closures under notice to air mission shape capacity more than the loudest alarm tone. The April 2010 ash crisis after the Eyjafjallajökull eruption showed how weather and debris could close half a continent in days rather than hours. European states applied ash concentration thresholds that grounded traffic across wide regions, and Vienna saw waves of cancellations that dwarfed any local storm impact. Instrument flight rules, after one initial expansion as instrument flight rules, could not trump airspace closures. So operations shifted from sequencing to information, with crews and passengers needing clear updates in minutes. The controller's role narrowed to keeping the remaining flights separated, while the airport managed stands and diversions that moved across hundreds of kilometers. Compared with a thunderstorm, ash did not permit tactical holes. Visibility appeared daily as runway visual range, after one initial expansion as runway visual range, reported in meters, and it tied directly to landing minima by runway and equipment. A runway with Category 3 instrument landing system, after one initial expansion as instrument landing system, allowed landings in very low visibility near 200 meters runway visual range, while a runway with Category 1 minima needed far more. Vienna rotated usage based on these limits and on braking action reports that translated snow, slush, or rain into coded friction levels. When runway visual range fell, the arrival rate dropped by single-digit flights per hour. When braking action improved, the rate climbed back in steps. Time-based spacing kept intervals stable when gusts or winter winds pushed aircraft around on final. Wind dictated runway configuration, and each switch consumed minutes and miles. A change from a southern flow to a northern flow required updated standard instrument departure routes and standard terminal arrival routes, and every aircraft already on downwind needed new headings to reach the correct final. The Automatic Terminal Information Service, after one initial expansion as Automatic Terminal Information Service, carried the new configuration in its lettered broadcast, and clearances followed within minutes. The comparison with a stable day was harsh. Each switch cut the arrival rate by several flights per hour until streams settled into the new legs. Controllers shortened vectors or extended downwinds in blocks of miles to absorb the change without stacking radio calls. Convective weather built its own timeline through cumulonimbus, after one initial expansion as cumulonimbus, cells that moved at tens of kilometers per hour. Ground-based weather radar highlighted cells in colors and heights, and pilots reported turbulence and hail on voice that updated the picture faster than any model. Controllers carved corridors that kept minimum distances from cells while trying to hold 3 nautical mile separation in terminal airspace. When cells parked over a fix, the corridor closed and demand piled up in holes that were measured in patterns and minutes. Compared with stratiform rain, convective days used more vectoring, more speed control, and more tactical holds. Diversions were planned rather than improvised when crosswinds or runway visual range exceeded limits for longer than a forecast window. Airlines named alternates 200 to 400 kilometers away by city pair, and Vienna coordinated with Bratislava, Budapest, Linz, or Munich based on runway lengths, instrument procedures, and parking. When diversions began, approach limited inbound acceptance to avoid go-arounds that burned fuel close to reserve levels. The network showed the ripple as slots at alternates tightened within an hour. The better the initial alternate selection in the flight plan, the less time was lost on the day itself. Notice to air missions after one initial expansion as notice to air missions shaped routes and availability with publishers that could add or subtract options in minutes. Temporary reserved airspace for military training opened or closed corridors. Unmanned aircraft restrictions near the city added altitude limits, and runway works published weeks ahead compressed taxi patterns. Controllers absorbed these items into pre-shift briefings and strip tags, and pilots heard them on the Automatic Terminal Information Service. After September 11, 2001 in the United States, security procedures in Europe tightened around sterile areas and air policing coordination, and that change persisted as background constraints rather than constant interceptions. The effect on the console was more coordination lines and fewer last-minute surprises. When weather and external constraints converged, mass cancellations outperformed marginal operations for safety and predictability. A day with steady ceilings and moderate winds under instrument flight rules ran at near-planned throughput, with spacing in miles and minutes holding steady. A day with ash or stalled thunderstorms forced ground decisions that cleared stands, kept taxiways open, and preserved crew duty times that were measured in hours rather than stretched in hopes of a narrow window. The practical contrast favored decisive cuts and clear alternates rather than chasing small gains on a saturated frequency. The micro-conclusion from Vienna and neighbors is that weather, ash, and airspace restrictions translate directly into miles, minutes, and available runways, and that translation can be made early if forecasts, thresholds, and notice to air missions are read with discipline. The next chapter looks at people and organizations, because procedures and tools only work when staffing, training, and support systems absorb stress across months and years rather than a single shift. In 1981, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization strike in the United States ended with 11,345 controllers dismissed by federal order, and Europe treated that event as a clear staffing risk case rather than a distant story. Training pipelines in Austria, Germany, and France lengthened to 2 to 3 years, with staged endorsements that gate access to positions step by step. Rosters built buffers of reserve duty measured in hours to absorb sickness or sudden traffic waves rather than stretching shifts. The lesson was simple and numeric. A thin bench fails quickly, whereas a thicker pipeline buys months of resilience. Air Safety Report after one initial expansion as Air Safety Report, systems convert small events into trend lines that management can act on in weeks rather than quarters. A Vienna team submits dozens to hundreds of entries per month that classify items such as late redbacks, unauthorized level deviations, or coordination slips. Each report carries a timestamp, a sector, and a phase such as climb or approach, which allows heat maps in 10 or 15-minute bins across a day. Instead of blame, the collection feeds corrective actions like refined phraseology or a new checklist step, and results appear as downward ticks in the next month's chart. Safety Management System. After one initial expansion as Safety Management System, frameworks turn those reports into a controlled cycle with hazard identification, risk assessment, and mitigation that is reviewed at least quarterly. Indicators include loss of separation rates per 100,000 flights, unstable approach counts per 1,000 arrivals, and communication error rates per 10,000 transmissions. Targets are numerical and public inside the unit, so teams see whether a change in strip tagging or a tweak in sector boundaries cut incidents by single-digit percentages. Rather than broad slogans, the system works on thresholds that trigger actions within days. Critical Incident Stress Management. After one initial expansion as Critical Incident Stress Management, lines address the human toll that follows an emergency or a serious incident by putting a peer and a clinician in the loop within 72 hours. A Vienna controller who handled a 7700 event sits for a structured debrief that runs for dozens of minutes, then receives a recovery plan that may include a simulator session before a return to live duty. Absence days are tracked in simple counts, and the unit watches whether CISM shortens recovery by weeks compared with ad hoc coping. Instead of assuming toughness, the organization measures well-being alongside separation. Training cadence ties skills to the calendar with simulator events 2 to 4 times per year, and with currency checks that expire after defined months. A controller who has not worked a peak bank since a spring schedule must complete scenarios that mirror real traffic levels by minute and by sector mix before reclaiming a rating. Emergency drills replay specific dates such as a winter day in 2019 with low runway visual range and a runway change at a set time like 7:30 p.m. The outputs are times between alert and action that drop in seconds between runs, and handover error counts that fall to single digits. Across Europe, incident and serious incident rates per 100,000 flights trended downward from the 2000s to the 2020s, even as surveillance density and reporting completeness rose. The paradox is visible on graphs that show more recorded minor events per month because monitoring improved, while the severe cases per year declined by double-digit percentages compared with the earlier decade. National supervisory authorities and the European Union Aviation Safety Agency publish these aggregates, and units like Vienna compare themselves against regional peers each quarter. The comparison keeps local pride in check and avoids complacency after quiet months. March 2020 brought a different threat to skill levels when passenger traffic fell by 80 to 90% across Europe in weeks. Rosters shrank to skeleton crews, but currency rules still demanded a minimum number of hours on position and a minimum number of approaches or emergencies handled in simulators. When traffic recovered in 2021 and 2022, units scheduled intensive refresher blocks measured in days for controllers who had worked only light sectors. The first months showed longer vectoring paths and slower speech rates by a few seconds, and those metrics returned to baseline only after persistent practice. The micro-conclusion on people and safety is grounded in numbers rather than slogans. Staffing pipelines count in years, reports count in hundreds, indicators count in thousands, and training counts in sessions per quarter. Vienna and its neighbors held to that arithmetic between 2001 and 2024, and the result was a steady reduction in high-severity events. The bridge to the final theme is technology, because new tools promise gains in seconds or miles, yet every gain must sit inside clear limits that a controller can trust in real time. European Union Regulation number 716/2014 set the pilot common project that guided single European sky air traffic management research deployments between 2014 and 2024, and that agenda shaped consoles in Vienna and beyond. The regulation named data link services, network operations, and performance-based navigation as priorities with dates attached to milestones. Local plans converted those targets into procurement, training, and go-live windows measured in months. Rather than a single big switch, the rollouts arrived in waves that changed habits by small steps. Remote tower operations became a visible outcome as cameras, infrared sensors, and high-resolution displays replaced direct out-the-window views at lower-density fields in Scandinavia and later in Central Europe. A single controller could support more than one aerodrome in sequence, with duty time and complexity capped by strict numbers such as movements per hour. Trials started in the 2010s and matured toward the 2020s, with Vienna watching the pattern for ideas on contingency services. The benefit was staffing flexibility in kilometers away from the runway, yet procedures stayed conservative, with runway inspections and low visibility operations still driven by measured thresholds. Machine learning conflict detectors entered test beds as assistants rather than replacements, trained on millions of track pairs gathered over months and years. These models flagged converging geometries seconds earlier than rule-based probes in some en route sectors, yet they stumbled on rare cases that did not appear often in historical data. Data scarcity around unusual military routes, atypical climb gradients, or emergency paths produce false positives or quiet misses in single-digit counts per week. Engineers responded with hybrid logic that kept deterministic thresholds alongside probability scores. The practical rule stayed the same. The controller decides, the alert advises. Algorithmic limits remained clearest in terminal areas, where tight legs in miles and quick speed changes in knots stretch any prediction that does not read intent from clearances. A base turn given at 5 miles with a 160 knot instruction can erase a model's forecast in seconds. En route, the same tools perform better because geometry changed slower and altitude blocks were wider in thousands of feet. Units measured value in seconds of earlier detection and in the rate of nuisance alerts per hour, and only promoted tools that cut the first while keeping the second manageable. Rather than trusting novelty, they trusted numbers. On January 11, 2023, the United States issued a nationwide ground stop after a failure in the Notice to Air mission system, which highlighted a basic truth about shared data services. Europe answered with audits of its own Notice to Air missions pipelines, with mirrored databases, cross-checks with the network manager, and fallback procedures that restored key notices in minutes if a path failed. Vienna folded the lesson into its morning briefings for a time window measured in weeks, then retained it as a checklist step for certain outages. The comparison across the Atlantic showed common fragility and different layers of resilience. The Next Generation Air Transportation System, after one initial expansion as Next Generation Air Transportation System, in the United States and the European Single European Sky Air Traffic Management Research family pursued similar ends by different routes. The American path tilted toward airport surface metering and time-based flows at large hubs first, while Europe leaned into network-level slotting and cross-border free routing in the upper airspace. Controller-pilot data link communications grew in crews on both sides, but voice held the terminal core for reasons measured in seconds per exchange. Both regions logged gains in minutes saved per flight and emissions reduced per city pair, yet both preserved human authority at the console. In 2024, free route airspace expanded to a network level in Europe and allowed more flights to file nearly direct paths across multiple states. Airlines reported time savings in single-digit minutes on common city pairs and fuel cuts in percentages that also landed in single digits. The load did not vanish. It moved, and sectors at the edges of former corridors felt new peaks at certain hours of the day. Vienna adapted by fine-tuning sector boundaries and coordination with military airspace managers whose flexible use schedules opened corridors measured in clock blocks. Instead of assuming uniform relief, managers tracked where complexity landed. Automation also touched towers and approaches with time-based spacing, wake recategorization, and improved arrival managers that push smoother timelines in minutes. Each tool arrived with validation datasets, operational trials, and go-no-go criteria that included acceptable alert rates and stable runway throughput under wind or low visibility. Controllers learned to trust the timelines only after months of stable performance and transparent failure modes. Where tools did not meet targets, they stayed in advisory mode rather than driving clearances. The micro-conclusion on technology across 2014 to 2024 is cautious. Automation adds seconds where data are rich and geometry is stable, and it strains where variability is high or data are thin. The bridge to a calm ending is simple. A controller can live with tools that make predictable errors at known rates, but not with opaque magic that forces guesswork at 7 a.m. or 7 p.m. A shift in Vienna in 2024 ties together events that stretch back to September 11, 2001, when the United States closed its airspace for days and Europe reassessed coordination and security timelines in minutes. It ties to April 2010, when ash shut down swaths of the continent, to January 24, 2002, when reduced vertical separation minima doubled usable flight levels, and to March 2020, when demand vanished by 80 to 90%. The controller's day moves across those dates in the form of procedures, checklists, and timers that live at the console. The choices are local in seconds and miles, but the causes and constraints arrive from decades and from borders hundreds of kilometers away. The final point is not drama, but arithmetic. Workload emerges from movements per hour, transmissions per minute, minima in miles and feet, and buffers measured in seconds. Tools return seconds when they are designed around those numbers, and they steal seconds when they are not. People hold the line when training, reporting, and support appear in counts per quarter and per year. That is why lasting a day as an air traffic controller in Europe remains difficult in 2024. The limits are visible, the gains are incremental, and the outcome is safe when numbers and discipline match.